So today I wanted to talk to you a little bit about a project that I've been working on at the moment. And if you follow me on social media or if you subscribe to this channel already, you may have seen that I'm working on a spatial sound installation. And this is my first spatial sound installation that I've ever made. A little bit about it. It's called The Sounds of King's Cross and it was commissioned by King's Place, which is an arts venue in the King's Cross area. And they were interested in me making a sound experience that highlights the importance of urban nature in the city. And so over the last few months I've been collecting interviews and field recordings from the green and blue spaces around King's Cross, and I've weaved them together into this spatial sound experience. So what is a spatial sound installation? So rather than having just one speaker, which you might have with a radio, or two speakers or two headphones, a spatial sound installation is when you have a number of speakers giving a sound artist the freedom to send or move different sounds around a space. So as an audience member, it feels much more immersive than if you just had the stereo or the mono experience. And so in my case, I've been working with D&B Soundscape, who have this incredible spatial sound software and array of speakers. I think the one I'm using has upwards of 46 different speakers and they're all dotted around the room in a ring. And it means that I could put an interview over here, a bat circling around the room over your head, the atmosphere around King's Cross in different spaces. For me, it just allows me to create this environment around the listener that just feels more exciting, really. So I thought I'd talk a little bit today just about the installation, the process behind creating it, and some things I've learned along the way, just in case it's helpful. Also, if you happen to be free this Saturday, and if you happen to be near London, there are two listening sessions of the installation at 6:30 and 7 p.m. at King's Place, followed by a gig by me and my band, supported by an artist called Natalie Wildgoose. So there's that. If you don't live near London or if you're not free, hopefully at some stage it will be released digitally. So make sure you follow my newsletter, my social media and everything, and I'll keep you updated that way. So let's get into it. Firstly, how did the installation come about? So up until this point, I'd not really done much spatial audio. I'd done some radio/podcast work for binaural, and I'd also previously, before the pandemic, been working in the theatre industry as a sound designer and composer. So in those contexts, there would be multiple speakers and I could send different sounds to different speakers. So say if there was a train that sounded like it was coming from backstage, a speaker backstage meant that I could place that sound there. So that was roughly the extent of the experience I'd had with spatial audio. Sometime last year, King's Place got in touch and had said that they'd been listening to a podcast I work for. So if you don't know, I produce a mid-month episode called Found Sounds for the As the Season Turns podcast. And in these episodes, I go and interview different practitioners working across the arts and the natural world. So they might be food growers or wood artists or clothes makers inspired by the landscape or printmakers inspired by folklore. And I interview them, I gather field recordings from their practice, so it could be the sound of them snipping cloth or sowing seeds, or even just the sound of their environment and where they live. And the director, Sam McShane, had heard this and wanted me to do similar interviews and field recording collections for the green spaces around King's Cross. So we began having conversations. I knew I wanted some sort of novel field recordings to be in there, so I used an underwater microphone for part of it. I got some recordings of bats from a specific nature reserve, and I also knew I really wanted to do these interviews. So then we got around to planning it. King's Place and I agreed on 3 different locations that we wanted to feature in the installation that we felt represented different forms of urban nature within King's Cross. So the first was Camley Street Natural Park, which is this amazing nature reserve near Coldrops Yard. The second is Word on the Water, a floating bookshop on a canal boat in Regent's Canal. And then the Story Garden, which is by an organisation called Global Generation. It's a community garden that teaches people how to cook, how to grow, and they also have many community events encouraging telling stories and cultural exchange. A couple of months ago, I started collecting the field recordings. I wasn't able to start doing this last year because of various projects. And actually one of the challenges I faced was in London, it's only really starting to turn into spring now. So it was quite quiet in February and March, which was a challenge because when you're field recording, you want lots of wildlife sounds, you want to be able to capture the hubbub. And because it was cold, there was just less activity going on. However, it was actually really interesting recording at this time, seeing how people were acting in winter, seeing the wildlife starting to nest. So despite it not being the height of life, it was still amazing to be able to capture the sounds around this time. Some more challenges I faced included recording in a city as opposed to a more remote area. Usually I am recording in forests, by the coast, in fields. I'm not particularly used to actually recording in urban spaces despite living in one myself. It meant I had to be more careful about where I was putting my kit. There was also the fact that my equipment looks quite peculiar and people were looking at me, maybe in slightly funny ways, going, what is she doing? What it really showed me was the importance of just sitting there and recording, and rather than chasing any particular sound, actually just the act of sitting there, letting the microphone record, activity would start to happen around me. And say if I was chasing the sound of a goose, rather than going up and down the river trying to find one, there was this magic that happened when I would sit and stay still, where eventually these sounds would arise. For me as well, sometimes I get frustrated when I'm in remote areas and a plane goes overhead or there's the sound of a road and I go, I had this perfect recording and now we humans have disrupted it again. But what I'm finding increasingly in my work is the importance of including those sounds. I think particularly in the times we find ourselves in where there are more environmental crises, there's more humans moving to cities, and the importance of wildlife and these urban nature spaces is only becoming more paramount. It makes sense to include the human and it feels more truthful. It kind of shows us where we're actually at right now. So there was a real freedom in being able to record those sounds and go, yeah, this is what urban nature sounds like. This is what the city sounds like. And what came through in one of the interviews later, I'll share a snippet of it, was this idea of humans and nature not having to be two discrete entities, and how wild it is that we even think of it in that way these days, given that we ourselves are in constant flux with the environment. At least 50% of our cells are bacteria, and it's been shown that bacteria affects our moods, it affects our thoughts. So even ourselves, we are constantly interacting with the environment just through the food we eat, the water we drink, everything like that. So it was actually a bit of a relief to be able to capture that through the audio. So I went about recording. I took my usual setup, which is my Mix Pre 6, which is an interface, and my two DPA 4060s, which are two omnidirectional microphones. So I'd have them as a stereo pair. Each records in 360, so you get this really nice detailed audio. So that's what I went around with to begin with. I then also used my hydrophone to record underwater, and I also got some bat recordings from the reserve officer at Camley Street Natural Park. We did try and record the bats while I was there, but sadly the temperature just dropped. We'd had a really warm week, and then the day that I decided I was going to go and record the bats, the temperature dropped and the bats, they were hibernating, they were gone. When it came to recording the interviews, I used a new bit of kit that I got off eBay, and it was a reporter mic. And I decided to use a mono mic for the interviews because I knew I was going to be mixing it spatially, and I wanted the voices of the interviewees to be really strong and more easily localized. Whereas when I was using stereo recordings, I wasn't 100% sure how that would translate to a spatial sound system. So I conducted these interviews with Mara Couters from Camley Street Natural Park, Paddy from Word on the Water, and the team at Global Generation at the Story Garden. And I wanted to share some snippets of these interviews with you now, some of the moments that I found particularly thought-provoking. So here we go.
There's just something around any corner, under any log, in between a leaf, so much life everywhere you look, which is so beautiful. And it's what we're trying to show to our visitors, to our schools. Living in the city definitely isolates you a bit from all the nature. It should be seen on every corner. There should be a little bit of wildlife space that we get to create and we choose to have there and to keep there. It's so important. It's been proven that if kids don't have nice memories outdoors within a wild setting, they won't be inclined to care about wildlife later on in life. So for us, especially with kids, it's very important.
Well, everything's better on a boat is a very important maxim. I think bookshops are really important anyway, especially now. They represent lots of things that people feel seem to be disappearing. And then there's something about being on a boat, it's liminal, you leave the world and you're in a different world. And especially in the city, because another thing about canals is they're like arteries of the countryside running through the city. It's like countryside rules apply on the towpath, people are friendly. It's amazing how the culture just changes as soon as you're by water and you're maybe 4 meters lower down than the rest of the city.
Being a really inner city person, I love the sounds of the city. Not so much the traffic, but almost this kind of orchestra between a police car going like wheel, wheel. You've got like the diggers going on, some bird song, sometimes like when the weather's really crazy. And I think it's just this soup of sounds.
That sound that you get from the building, definitely. And then the other rumbles of the city. But then when you tune in, you can like hear the wind blowing, little birds moving around singing. You can hear the residents coming in and doing gardening. So you've got a mixture of like busyness happening.
I think it's nice to be reminded that we are in a city. You know, I personally love living in a city and having that hubbub. You know, I think often we feel or we believe that nature is separate from us and is separate from urban areas, and nature, wild spaces can only exist where humans don't. And actually, I think what having this mix of sounds, the nature sounds mixed in with the urban sounds, reminds you is that actually we are part of nature, and those two things don't have to be completely mutually exclusive. And there is a way, hopefully, that we can align those things more closely.
So then came the editing process. I'm not going to talk too much about this, but essentially I was cutting down the interviews, I was weaving the soundscapes, the field recordings behind it. And again, because I knew I was going to be mixing it spatially, I didn't worry too much about having too much sound. In fact, I wanted many layers of these recordings from around King's Place, so that when it got to the mixing session, I could play around with it and I could have one recording kind of over here, that was maybe the sound of the station, and over here the sound of the road, whatever it might be. So my editing process was get the best bits of the interviews, get the best field recordings, but also give myself the flexibility for when I am in the mixing room to have multiple sound files. I also added in a bit of music. I used my Korg Minilog, which is a little synth, to add some ambient textures to it. So I'll play a little bit here. And finally, after many days of editing and adding music, it got to the mixing day. And this was such a fun day. I went to the Science Museum on Exhibition Road in Kensington, where D&B has a soundscape mixing room. I was in this room with all of these speakers, computer in the middle, and I could spend the working day slowly going through my sound piece, choosing where I wanted different stems to be linked to. I could automate the movement of the sounds, which means that if I wanted a sound to start in a speaker here in the room, I could then make it move around, so then it would go in front of you. So there are a few fun moments in the installation. For For example, there's a skateboard that kind of sweeps around the back of the audience's head. There's this bit where we have the bat sounds, so that kind of darts around the room. We have a bee that buzzes around the room. Even with the more static sounds, like wanting my voiceover to be in the centre of the room, having the interviews in slightly different places, so it just gives it that bit of dynamism. And also with the stereo recordings, Wayne from D&B gave me this really good tip, which was just having them slightly move, so it gave them this imperceptible movement, but it just keeps the listening experience alive. And as I said, one thing I was worried about was how these stereo recordings would translate to the spatial setup. About halfway through collecting field recordings, I suddenly went, oh, should I really have been recording in ambisonic, so recording with 5 microphones so I could really get a spatial recording of these different environments. But actually, by having these different stereo recordings layered up and going through almost stereo channels within the room, it has this sort of feeling of slightly heightened reality where 1 minute you can be right next to a train and hear it screech past, and then you've got the sound of a bike or a pedestrian, and you move through these spaces almost like going through a dream or something. It actually worked really well, so I was really pleased with that. And now the installation is done, and it's always that strange thing when you've been working on something for weeks or months, or I've known about this project for maybe about a year. Now it's just time to share it with people. So again, if you're free on Saturday and in London, please do come along, but watch your space for future spatial sound installations or iterations of this specific project. If you do have any questions about the process, please do put them in the comment section below. I'd love to hear from you. If you would like to experience some of my work, you can listen to my music. There's some links in the description below. Also, there's a link to my website where I have the various sound projects, podcasts, radio shows, everything that I've been working on. So please do check it out. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a lovely day.